So, Grant, the will is not the only vehicle for estate planning. There are others. What would you say is the second most common type of vehicle for estate planning, and why is it potentially a good option?
Yeah, I think, outside of the will, the second most common estate planning vehicle or tool that we see is the revocable living trust. And essentially, it's a document that you have an attorney draft for you now, while you're living. You go about retitling all of your assets into the name of the trust, and doing that now. And the purpose of this trust, generally the main goal of doing this is to avoid probate. You avoid both the time delays of probate, the costs of probate. That's the main goal of setting up the revocable living trust. There are other benefits, which I think are meaningful as well. We talked earlier about providing for your incapacity in the event that you lose capacity, having a durable power of attorney in place. The revocable living trust is another tool. Once your assets are in the trust, typically you name yourself as the initial trustee, you and your spouse as co-trustees. So you can still manage those assets for your own benefit as primary trustee and beneficiary. But where it comes into play with incapacity is if you were to lose incapacity, or if you were to lose capacity, that's when the successor trustee would step into place and start managing those assets now for your benefit. So it's a great tool, and probably one of the more common tools that we see used.
Now, tell me a little bit about estate taxes, because I think this is where we finally want to start having that conversation. Is there any benefit there in terms of estate taxes with the revocable living trust?
That's a great question. We talked about when you have a will in place and you pass away, your assets get a step up in basis. Your cost basis in those investments is stepped up to the current market value, resulting in significant savings on capital gains taxes. That same thing applies to the revocable living trust. When you pass away, those assets still get the step up in basis. However, the revocable living trust is not a tool utilized to help you in any way reduce your estate taxes. So if you have a taxable estate, then you would need to consider other vehicles, other planning strategies, which we will address later.
Sure. One of the difficulties I found with revocable living trusts, and it's not something that can't be overcome, but is making sure, as you mentioned, you get all of the assets retitled into the name of the trust. Or if an asset like a bank account or an investment account has a POD beneficiary, making sure that that POD beneficiary is the trust. And, a lot of times people think they've got everything in there, but there's always something. A lot of times vehicles are something that come up because you've bought a new vehicle since you made the trust. Mineral rights are another thing that come up often that you may not be aware of that for whatever reason don't get titled into the trust. And so it's important to have in your last will and testament what's called a pour over provision, meaning if any of the assets aren't, in that trust, then they go through the will, and the will pours over those assets into the trust. And that's just kind of a safeguard to make sure that ultimately everything ends up in the trust, even if you don't avoid probate like you hope to.
Yeah, that's a great point. It's a great tool that avoids probate, and you can transfer assets essentially by contract instead of through probate. But like a lot of these strategies and vehicles, it requires attention to detail as you set it up, working with qualified advisors, and obviously definitely a qualified attorney, and staying on top of it as the years progress, and as you mentioned about vehicles, going back and assessing and ensuring that everything is either titled in the trust, in the name of the trust, or that it's going to get picked up, through the pour over will.
And one of the questions I get all the time is, okay, your first financial trust and asset management. So I want to trust. Are you going to create that trust for me? And how do you respond to that when people ask you that?
Yeah, that question does come up a lot. As you can see from this conversation, we're quite knowledgeable as it relates to common estate planning tactics, but we always work with our clients and their attorney and their CPA. and the attorney is the one who actually drafts the documents. We do not draft trust agreements at First Financial Trust.
But we can get you with the right people who are competent, know what they're doing, are professionals, and they'll take care of that for you.
That's right, and our role also could be implemented later in the event that a successor trustee is needed and there's an interest in a corporate successor trustee. We talked about some of the benefits of that when we talked about corporate executors, but having someone who understands filing tax returns and managing investments, a corporate trustee in this instance could add a lot of value from that standpoint.
Yeah, I very much agree.